So tonight, I think this is the third in the series on the Constitution. I'll be talking about the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, and in many ways, they're kind of America's first political factions, something I'll discuss. And while this is very much history, it's also current events. The American Revolution is a living revolution. It's still with us. We live with the political settlement and the society that it created. And as I'll mention, we're really, and I think you'll just see this, we're in many ways in the same patterns of politics, believe it or not. They go all the way back to the 1780s. Uh, so, uh, so this is history, but also current events. So we can think about this as a little bit of a civics lesson as well. And just to get a few definitions out of the way, the Federalists, the original Federalists, were people that supported the ratification of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists opposed the ratification of the Constitution. And the naming is really interesting. The Anti-Federalists were never very happy being tagged with the name Anti-Federalist because it's never good to be anti-anything in politics. And they felt that like they were the true Federalists, that they were for the true sharing of power between the national government and state governments, what the name federal really kind of refers to. And they thought the Federalists were actually the nationalists or the consolidationists because they didn't allow enough space for state power. But, politics is not always fair. And the Anti-Federalists ended up with this name. And as I'll discuss, they were a pretty profound, formidable opponents to the Federalists. And it was anything but inevitable that the Constitution would have been ratified or would have ended up in the shape that it was. So without further ado, let's move on to get into some of the specifics and talk about the typical folks who would be Federalists or Anti-Federalists. Your prototypical Federalist was someone who, in the American Revolutionary War, either served in the Continental Army or in the Continental Congress. So in these national institutions. And in doing that, they really felt the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation, particularly the fact that the Articles didn't allow for the raising of revenue at the national level. And so we have the founder of the 21st century here, Alexander Hamilton, who was a Federalist. And in an older literature, the Federalists were referred to as cosmopolitans because they were generally elites, maybe had finer tastes than the Anti-Federalists. And the name in short in the literature for them were the Cosmos. On the other side, you see Patrick Henry, who in many ways checked all the boxes for an Anti-Federalist. During the American Revolution, Anti-Federalists generally served at the state level, particularly in state militias and state government. And Patrick Henry did both in Virginia as governor and for a short time in the militia. And in many respects, they didn't see the problem with the Articles of Confederation because it gave them what they wanted, and that was sovereignty at the state level, that the states were able to control their own affairs. And after all, this is what the Americans really wanted out of the revolution with Great Britain. And so in this older literature, the localists are referred to as the locos. And as we know now, that is the crazies. And some people thought they were, but not everyone. All right, so this is a geographical kind of depiction of the order of ratification of the Constitution. And I put this up here partly because I put this up for my students and I asked them to kind of look at this and tell me what's the geographical logic of ratification. And it's kind of a mean question because there really isn't any. It's really kind of all over the place. And if there's any real logic to the politics of the era, and this is similar to today, it's really an urban-rural split. That within these individual states, the people that supported ratification were generally on the eastern seaboard. They were in places of heavier population, and those who were opposed were in the western parts of the states. The other logic was actually that small states were more eager to ratify the Constitution than larger states. And this is something of a surprise. And I'll put up another kind of image to illustrate this. 4 out of the first 5 states to ratify were small states. And part of the theory of historians on this is that going into the Philadelphia Convention, they really had everything to lose. And in the original Virginia plan, which I imagine you've talked about in the last couple of weeks a little bit, it was a very, very strong national government with all representation in Congress apportioned by population. And the fact that the small states got parity out of the Connecticut Compromise, that they got equal representation in the Senate, they really saw something of a victory. And so when it came to ratify, the small states, were first in line. Plus, if you've ever seen Delaware's license plates, they just wanted to be called the first state. They're obviously going for that. So let's look at some of the arguments that the Anti-Federalists had against the Constitution. The Constitution, for the most part, has worked incredibly well. It's the longest continuous national frame of government, written frame of government in the world. And so sometimes it's kind of hard for us and maybe our students to understand, what did people have against it? What was wrong with it? Well, the very first argument that the Anti-Federalists had was that there was no Bill of Rights. There was no list of protections of individual liberties, which had become something of a hallmark of British history and also state constitutions. And this is something that another leading Anti-Federalist, George Mason, proposed during the Philadelphia Convention, but he did so in September of 1787, after the delegates had been meeting for about 4 months, and nobody wanted to hash that out. And so that became a real point of contention for him and other Anti-Federalists. The other leading argument was that, similar to what I mentioned in the intro, that the Federalists were not promoting true federalism, that instead this was a consolidated central government that didn't really leave much room for the states, especially compared to the Articles of Confederation. And then the third argument was that this wasn't very democratic, that it wasn't very democratic or representative. People were used to knowing their state representatives. They came from small districts, and the congressional districts in the original Constitution were 30,000 citizens per representative. And this seemed like an enormous number, and that they would never possibly know their own representative. Well, just think that now the ratio is about 800,000 people per representative, which makes the United States have the least direct representative system actually in the Western world. And it's really all because of architecture. That's all the people that can fit, 435 people in the House of Representatives. Here are some of the leading Anti-Federalist figures. I already mentioned Patrick Henry of Virginia, his fellow Virginian, George Mason, who had written the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is part of the Virginia State Constitution, and in many respects is the document that most influenced the Declaration of Independence, just in terms of the actual language. More of it comes from Mason than anybody else, even John Locke. And then Mercy Otis Warren, who it's great that is part of the standards in Texas, the TEACs. Usually she's associated with the American Revolution. I think that's how she shows up in the Texas standards. But she continues to be involved in politics, and she opposed the Constitution for a number of reasons. And we have one of my primary documents for tonight is from Mercy Otis Warren. So we'll get a little bit deeper into that. So how did the Federalists handle these arguments by the Anti-Federalists? What did they say? Well, they came up with a number of writings, and the most famous of which were called in the time the Federalists. Today we call them the Federalist Papers. These 85 essays that were originally anonymously written. We know today, and if you know your Hamilton musical, you know that Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 of them. James Madison wrote 29, and John Jay wrote 5. And they had a lot of answers. They had 85 answers to all of these anti-federalist arguments. And it's difficult stuff. I mean, if this is also part of the standards, and so you probably have to have your students read some of these, and it can be tough going, even for college students. But there's a lot of clever arguments. One is that even though it might not be as directly representative as other republics or state legislatures, the Constitution, guarantees people's rights, better than other systems because the minority is protected. And why is the political minority protected under the U.S. system? Because of all the checks and balances, and because it's so hard to pass legislation, right? That's the work of James Madison and ideas he fleshes out in Federalist 10. The answer to the accusation of consolidated government comes in a lot of Federalist papers, maybe most famously number 51, which discusses the various checks and balances in the United States government, and that it's not just one single entity, but many levels, and it's difficult, as I mentioned, to get anything done. And the last argument, which we'll spend more time in with our document session, concerns the Bill of Rights. And this ultimately becomes a losing argument for the Federalists. And we'll get into the details. I don't know if I want to reveal all of it right now, except to say they did have an argument against the Bill of Rights, which makes it really, really, really fascinating. So if we go back to the order of ratification, I first had up those original 5 states that was dominated by the small states. One of the things they did in the Philadelphia Convention is they determined that it would only take 9 states for the Constitution to go into effect. And this was a huge change from the Articles, which of course required all 13 states. And so they eventually hit the 9th state, New Hampshire, in June of 1781. You can see that right there. But then it got to be really, tough going. It was tough, really, even to get to 9. But of course, they wanted all of the states. And the big hang-up with these larger last states was that issue of the Bill of Rights, that people didn't trust the fact that the Constitution didn't protect in a really intentional way people's liberties. And so James Madison, who even in his own lifetime was known as the father of the Constitution, made a compromise. And we see this throughout early American history, all these amazing compromises. And where I'm speaking to you from in Washington, D.C., we finally got a compromise here a few days ago, a surprise on the budget situation. And so Madison decided that he was going to have to give in on this idea of the Bill of Rights. And of course, he supported individual liberties anyways. And so starting in the Virginia ratifying convention and carrying forward after that in an amazing congressional race he was in against another future president, James Monroe, who acted as an anti-federalist of sorts, Madison promised a Bill of Rights. He basically said the first Congress of the United States would pass amendments for personal liberties. And this was really smart politics because it managed to get the remaining states, as I'll show, but it was at a fairly small cost. They didn't have to restructure the entire Constitution, the entire frame of government in making this particular compromise. So what you're looking at now, you might not believe this, and you're going to meet with Charlie Flanagan next week of the National Archives, and he might not believe it either. But I've gotten from a secret source inside of the archives that this was the actual original version of the Bill of Rights. It was in cartoon form, something that nobody really knows, but it's a humanities Texas first right here. Maybe you shouldn't mention this to Charlie next week. So we know the 10 amendments, right? And most famously, the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly. What a lot of people don't know is that the original First Amendment was actually the Third Amendment. and this is something that Charlie will probably talk about in more detail next week. These are actually the first two amendments. Congress passed 12. They sent them to the states for ratification, and only 10 were ratified. And it was in that way that what we call the First Amendment now became the First Amendment, because these first two were not passed. The very first one, I'll save you from reading all of that. It basically said that at the very most, there would be a representative for every 50,000 people in the United States, that it wouldn't become any more than that. And if this amendment had passed and we had it to this day, I think we'd have something like 6,000 members of Congress or something like that. We would need like the Star Wars virtual Congress for everyone to meet. The Second Amendment, as you can see, is actually our most recent amendment. So it's almost our very first amendment that was passed by Congress, and it was ratified in 1992 through the efforts actually of a Texas college student, that a student at the University of Texas discovered in a class. He wrote a paper about this amendment, that there was no statute of limitations on this particular amendment, meaning that there was no clock on 3/4 of the states ratifying it. And therefore, he began to build a campaign to ratify the 27th Amendment, which basically says that Congress cannot receive a pay raise that it enacts in the session in which he enacts it. Congress has to wait basically to get its raise, and it seems very logical. Well, the student, I think I read, received a C- on the original paper, so it shows how smart the Professor Ariat is. You can't trust these college professors, but that the student got the last laugh. I haven't seen anybody start a cause for the First Amendment, so there's always room for that if you want a project for your students. So this helped in Virginia, as I mentioned, and there was a huge celebration planned in Virginia for the ratification of the Constitution. This is where I live, in Alexandria, Virginia, and that's where the celebration was at. It was at a place called Wise's Tavern. This is the place where George Washington was first addressed as president. Of course, that would come a little bit later, a year or so later after ratification. And at that time, Virginia really thought they would be the 9th state. And for a long time, they actually thought they were the 9th state, until news arrived that New Hampshire had ratified before them. And so they had to ditch all their plans celebrating the number 9, and they came up with 10 was the magic number. And one of the primary documents that I've shared with you are the toasts that were published in the newspaper, celebrating the ratification. And it gives you a little bit of an insight into Federalist political culture. And if we have time later, we can work through those, and you can get a beverage of choice. So we'll really make this the history happy hour. So Virginia ratifies. That means there was only 2 states left: North Carolina, and you can see, New York ratified shortly after Virginia. So there's 2 states left: North Carolina and Rhode Island. This was a running cartoon that was in the Massachusetts Sentinel that basically kept track of ratification using these pillars. And so by August of 1788, there was just 2 states left. And North Carolina was particularly hung up on this Bill of Rights issue. And they didn't want to just trust that Congress was going to do this. They wanted to see Congress actually enact the amendments, which once they did, North Carolina ratified. But Rhode Island was a totally different story. And to close out here, I'm going to focus on Rhode Island as a way of really understanding these arguments over the Constitution, and why a state can hold out for almost 2 years not ratifying the Constitution. So inspired by my 1980s childhood and David Letterman, here's the top 10 reasons Rhode Island did not ratify the Constitution. And we'll start with number 10, Rhode Island Nation. Rhode Island had always been different. I'm sure a lot of you teach about the colonial period when Rhode Island is known as Rogue Island, because it accepted all the the dissenters and people that were not accepted in Massachusetts and other parts of New England. Number 9, the Constitution limits democracy. This is one of the points I was making, that today we think about the Constitution as protecting democracy in so many ways, but at this time, the Articles of Confederation in many ways had actually provided for more democracy at the state level, and this is something that actually frustrated a lot of those elites, those cosmos. They wanted, as I've mentioned, more power centered in the national government and more elite rule. Number 8, and give up the benefits of this coastline. One of the problems for a lot of the small states is they didn't have great ports. They didn't have a great coastline, a lot of trade. New Jersey kind of fell into this category. But Rhode Island, of course, had amazing ports. And so for a while, they thought they could make it on their own. And there's just kind of incredible similarity, analogy between Rhode Island and Texas. I think they're the two states we have that were independent republics the longest. Texas longer than Rhode Island. Number 7, paper money for life. So, of course, under the Articles, one of the benefits for all the individual states is that they could print their own money. And this was something that was taken away by the Constitution. And this is something that, again, frustrated these folks that were more interested in local state power. 6, it pays to be small. So under the Articles, every state had equal power, right? Votes were all equal. Rhode Island didn't attend the Philadelphia Convention. And so they never went through this process, this near death experience of losing everything with the Virginia Plan. And they missed the benefit of the Connecticut Compromise. So they were still kind of living in the past, wanting total equality in the houses of Congress. Number 5, where is the Bill of Rights? Here's that leading argument that comes up time and again, and the Rhode Islanders were as hung up on this as everyone else. Number 4, the Constitution protects slavery. Rhode Island, particularly Newport, had an active role in the Atlantic slave trade, but it also had a large Quaker population and had one of the earliest anti-slavery contingents in the early United States. And so people are beginning to oppose slavery. And through the 3/5 Compromise, the Fugitive Labor Clause, the provision about the Atlantic slave trade in the Constitution, there's all these ways that slavery was protected. And so people in the North are beginning to oppose it for that reason. Number 3, Rogue Island this. After a while, that should be a bumper sticker right there. Rogue Island this. After a while, I think Rhode Island holding out just became a badge of honor. And the more they got criticized by people like George Washington, the more that they wanted to hang strong and stick it out. Number 2, your Federalists can beat up our Federalists. Because Rhode Island had never attended the Philadelphia Convention, they never really had that strong group of Federalists as a core. And so there was no one really to promote the Constitution in that state. The leading candidate probably would have been Nathaniel Greene, the most important officer in the Continental Army after George Washington. He was from Rhode Island, raised a Quaker, became a fighting ex-Quaker. And after the Revolution, he actually retired to Georgia. And this is a cautionary tale for all Northerners that go south. He actually died of heat stroke. So it was hot back then as well. And they lost who might have been their strongest Federalist. And number 1, gotta do the drum roll. I'll do my own drum roll. We're just not that into you. Popular opinion of Rhode Islanders. They actually took votes on whether to ratify the Constitution or not. And multiple times, it was actually defeated. And so for all of these reasons, we kind of get some insight into the fact that the Constitution wasn't always, just a guaranteed outcome for all of these different states. Now, to stay on Rhode Island and to kind of stick with this story about the Anti-Federalists and what they accomplished, they didn't succeed in their main goal of defeating the Constitution, but they did win the Bill of Rights, which, if you ask any average American what's their favorite part of the Constitution, it's almost going to be automatic that they're going to mention something from the Bill of Rights. And so a story to close out here involves George Washington. During his presidency, he did a national tour. He visited every state. He started with the northern states in the fall of 1789. And on that tour, he skipped Rhode Island because they hadn't ratified the Constitution. So when they finally ratified in May of 1790, he came back to Rhode Island, and he visited that August of 1790. And among the places he visited was the Touro Synagogue in Newport, which at that time, and this is still true, is the oldest synagogue in the United States. And like so many religious groups, Jews wondered whether they would have true religious liberty in the new United States. And George Washington always answered, very strongly on that point and said, yes, absolutely, there will be religious liberty, whether the groups were Quakers, Baptists, Methodists, Catholics. All of these groups had been marginalized during the colonial period. I had the chance to visit Rhode Island for the 225th anniversary of Washington's visit, and they had the best promotion posters I've ever seen. They said, "Hide your cherry trees, Washington returns to Rhode Island." And I was traveling with the person at Mount Vernon that plays George Washington, so I kind of felt like I was part of the presidential delegation. So here's the letter that Washington wrote, and I'll use my cursor here to kind of give you the key line here, the key lines here, that he essentially parroted back to the congregation. He said, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily," and I'm going on to the next page now. I might have lost some of you since none of us can read cursive anymore. So, "For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." And so, 21st century translation, Washington is saying, absolutely, you won't only be tolerated, but you'll be embraced in this new United States. And it's a great line: "To bigotry, no sanction, to persecution, no assistance." And it reminds us that, although Washington and most of the other founders were woefully short on the issues of race and slavery, they were actually quite progressive in terms of religious liberty, even for today. And we think of all the problems today with anti-Semitism in both the United States and the world. And so the larger point is that, Washington embraced this idea that is, codified, that's ratified in the First Amendment, and that the Anti-Federalists had fought for, that had, helped to secure the full ratification of the Constitution. So if we close out this story, and I got to do so with a Joe Kabilka line, even though it doesn't quite work with this. Kabilka didn't go to PowerPoint school, and I wasn't admitted either, Joe. So I just flash all this text on here in a small font. And what this is it's actually very political science-y. That's a technical term. Political scientists love to study party systems throughout history. And basically what this means is in the two-party system, these periods of time in which there's a certain character about the issues of the day, and that usually one party dominates over another. And my point in ending with this is that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, if you see at the very top, we're really talking about pre-parties. They aren't like fully fledged political parties. And for a fully fledged political party, you really need to recognize the right of your opposition to exist. This is sometimes called the loyal opposition. You're not out just to completely destroy the other side. You see some utility in them. And the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, at a time, they really saw this as an existential struggle, that one really had to defeat the other. And that kind of spirit does carry over into the first party system with the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, who are sometimes called proto parties because they also didn't really recognize the others' right to exist. They wanted to destroy their opposition. The Anti-Federalist ethos, this idea of this rural, common person, anti-elite mentality, really carries over in the Democratic Republicans. And of course, they're also known as the Jeffersonians. Because of this, Thomas Jefferson is sometimes mislabeled as an anti-federalist. He really wasn't either a Federalist or an anti-Federalist because he was just gone, right? He was in France. And that's another good thing we can learn from Hamilton. When he comes back and says, "What did I miss?" That's where he kind of realizes, oh, I think I share a lot of ideas with these people that were opposing the Constitution, but that wasn't actually him. And so what we see over the course of time is both of these original parties, both of their ideas and character kind of moving forward with one or the other parties. And there's some amazing kind of switches where through much of American history, Anti-Federalists really had more sway, more influence in the Democratic Party. And I think today, as you'll notice, a lot of especially the populist strain in the current Republican Party really, reflects a lot of those ideals and the character of the Anti-Federalists. So that's one takeaway. The other is that what I mentioned before, that compromise was necessary to, not only in the Philadelphia Convention, but also to get the Constitution ratified. And once the Anti-Federalists got the Bill of Rights, they actually became the greatest champions of the Constitution. So the people that opposed the Constitution end up celebrating it the most in the form of the Democratic Republicans, those Anti-Federalists that carry on in that political party. And they become the first group of strict constructionists, those people that are very tied to the exact language of the Constitution. So I'll stop there. I've been talking for a long time, and I'd love to get some questions.